the export compliance programs in their companies. We discuss issues that impact forwarders. We review and comment on current regulations and future regulatory changes. Try to be really engaged with the government on what's coming down the pike. We monitor outbound enforcement activity just to see if there are any trends that we think we need to address. And we're also committed to educating the exporting community. Now, when I say that, I know that the attendees today, there's quite a few very knowledgeable exporters and freight forwarders on this call today. I recognize a lot of the exporting companies as companies many of our freight forwarding members have handled business for. For every one of the knowledgeable exporters that a freight forwarder deals with, there's probably 3 that don't even realize that they're making an export transaction, and there's quite a bit of education that we have to do on that side. So that's what I mean when I say educating the exporting community. So we created a USPPI information sheet that we have posted on the website. We have a link to that in the presentation that you'll be able to see, and that's to help give information to the less educated or less knowledgeable exporters, new exporters, for instance. So now in 2013, we decided we would tackle the shipper's letter of instruction, and that's because even in our own group of export compliance professionals in the freight forwarding, we had a wide variety of shippers' letters of instruction, and not all of them could meet the current regulatory requirements for reporting. So several, it's a volunteer organization, NCBFAA, so it took us a while, and we sat down for quite a few meetings to try to figure out what do we really need on there, how can we make it fit, what's a logical flow on a document, and we had a working group handling that was chaired by Matilda Vasquez. And she did a fabulous job because it's a difficult thing to try to get a consensus. Everybody has their own ideas on what these things should be. So in the end, NCBFAA created an SLI model to assist forwarders and exporters in creating and modifying their SLI forms. So I'd like you to keep that in mind as we're going through this today. It's a model. It's so that you can look at this and say, do I have all the fields I need on my form? If you're an exporter that's providing information on your own forms, then you may just want to check and say, am I providing all of the information that I need? So the document is intended to give you a model so that you can create your own document. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the general purpose of an SLI, the reasons we thought a new SLI form was needed. We're going to highlight the key components, the things that are different on this new model, and then at the end we're going to take questions. Now you can send your questions in throughout the presentation. We'll address them at the end. I realize there could be some regulatory questions. We want to try to focus on the form and the use of the form. So if there are some regulatory questions and we can answer them, we will. We don't want to get too far off track. I think we all know that we could talk about routed export transactions for about 3 hours, and so we don't really want to do that unless it's related to how the form is used. So maybe you can just keep that in mind as we go through. So having said that now, I'd like to turn this over to Matilda so she can talk about SLIs in general.
Great. Thank you, Paulette. Okay, so thank you guys for joining us today. We're happy that you guys took the time to learn about our new SLI model. But before we get too involved with the webinar itself, I'd like to take a quick moment here just to thank Paulette for all her time and effort that she put into this project. I don't think she gives herself enough credit for all that she's done here, and we all truly appreciate that she's done quite a bit here. So without further ado, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm pretty excited about the new SLI model that we're going to put out today. We have a few things that we want to discuss before we get into the new SLI model itself. The group has created, we want to talk about the SLI document itself. So the SLI document, let's take a second to ask ourselves, what really is the purpose of the SLI? When you take a look at it, the main purposes were to collect and provide required data for reporting electronic information, which from this point forward we're going to be referring to it as EEI, and to authorize the forwarder or a filing agent to transmit the EEI through an automated export system, which is also known as the AES. There's been many variations of the SLI created throughout trade. These variations included some forwarders providing document or billing instructions on their SLI, or they reached out and altered their SLI to provide transportation instructions. In most recent years, due to the TSA requirement, some forwarders have modified to give consent to screen cargo, and then some of them included Incoterms and insurance. So due to those variations that I mentioned, I'm sure that you can see that there's a challenge to develop a document to accommodate all of these instructions. Another thing we need to keep in mind about SLIs is that there are sometimes conflicts between information needed for documentation and transportation and information needed versus for export control and reporting purposes. So shipper instructions. For our shippers listening in, we want you to know that we do hear you and we really do understand. Before we talk about why forwarders ask for SLIs, we want to acknowledge that many shippers have their own system-generated documentation that provides information that we're about to go through on the SLIs. From a regulatory standpoint, this is allowed. And as long as the forwarder has been properly authorized by the US PPI on a standard export transaction or by a foreign PPI on a routed export transaction, as long as all the required information is provided to the forwarder in writing, we understand that an SLI is not necessarily required. So we do understand that. So we go to the next slide. We ask ourselves, why do forwarders still prefer an SLI? Well, for one good reason, the shipper takes the responsibility for consolidating all the information. So, for example, grouping Schedule B numbers together, assigning the proper Schedule B to their ECCNs and the license authority. For a shipper's view, you know, when you're organizing domestic and foreign products, if you're creating a certificate of origin for a free trade agreement, that would also help with organization of the products on a line item basis. Record keeping, you know, it's good for both the exporter. You now have proof if the forwarder doesn't transmit correctly. You know, you have the information that you've given the forwarder, and you trust that they're transmitting it correctly. And it's also good for the forwarder to have, because they have proof of what has been provided to them for the filing. And if we can see, the SLI will assist forwarders who are working with less educated exporters or even first-time exporters who aren't even aware that they have to report this information. So it's a very key document, and you don't have to worry about not having a magnifying glass handy. I see that this old SED form we have up on the screen is rather small. We're going to get into more detail of it on the next screen. So if we can go to the next screen here. Okay, here's a closer look at the old SED form. This is just a view of the top portion of it, and this format has been inadequate for a long time. Let's take a look at the next slide, and you're going to take a look at the bottom portion of it. There we go. In the lower section here of the old form, you can see that the form does not have enough columns to provide required reporting information, nor does it allow for the line-by-line item reporting of license information. We've seen information on this form where the license box might say EAR / ECCN number like 5A002, and then the license box might say EAR 99 / and put a license exception there like ENC. So it may be unclear to which commodity line that license determination is belonging to. So to avoid confusion in the trade community and to ensure that critical licensing information was reported correctly, the SLI had to go underneath a complete makeover. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn the webinar over to Paulette now to introduce the new SLI model.
Thanks, Matilda. So we sat down and said, why do we think we need to create a new format? As Matilda said, on that old SED form, and from a freight forwarder standpoint, you would be surprised how many of those documents, even the actual SED form, still come into freight forwarders. So that was one of the things that drove us. It's like it's just inadequate. It was probably always inadequate. It's just that we've all become a lot more educated over these last 10 years especially. And so we also saw that even amongst our own group of compliance people that several people had redone their SLIs, yet maybe they missed something. You could report ECCNs by line item, but maybe not the licensing authority. So we still saw a lot of variation there. And then besides that, with the revised foreign trade regulations that become effective on April 5th, there's reporting requirements for 2 additional fields, ultimate consignee type and license value. So we also needed a way to collect that, because now we're going to be, we've been hearing about it for a long time. Census has been doing their town hall meetings. But at the end of the day, when it comes time to do it, we know that we will, from a forwarding standpoint, be begging companies for information because they don't realize that they need to do it. So by putting it on the form, it helps to educate people because they can see it and at least ask a question, what is this, what are you talking about? So I want to just mention here, we have it on the screen, that Census and Customs say that they will begin accepting those new fields on March 22nd, but they will be mandatory beginning April 5th. So you'll get a fatal error on an AES transmission if you don't transmit the ultimate consignee type. And if there's a license and you don't fill in the license value, you will get a fatal error. The other reason we looked at creating this was because we wanted to be able to provide additional guidance to the exporting community on what's supposed to go into those fields on an SLI. So you'll see when we get into the document that we have put in some guidance right into the document. So our intention, for NCBFAA's intention, was to provide a regulatory compliant model that forwarders and exporters can use to create or redesign their own company-specific document, to include the fields that will allow the forwarder to collect the required regulatory information, and to provide guidance to the USPPI on the filing requirements. And again, I acknowledge that a lot of people on this call today really know the requirements and have high standards for their forwarders and check on their forwarders to make sure they're filing correctly. But we also have that group of exporters. I mean, we're trying to increase exports in this country. That's bringing a lot of new people to the table, and they all need some education. So again, also to drive consistency in the way that the data is provided. So our focus when we created this document was to focus on the regulatory compliance data fields. So when we show you this document, you're not going to see some of the traditional transportation information that's usually on an SLI. You're not going to see a place to pick prepaid or collect, insurance, the mode of transportation, consent to screen, which some forwarders are putting on their SLI. Incoterms is always this big debate, amongst forwarders. Should we put them? Shouldn't we put them? And other fields. And the reason we didn't do it is because even in our own committee, there was such a wide variety of what companies like to have on their SLIs that we decided that it's best to leave that to the companies to design that part of the SLI themselves. So you'll see that we have a space for it, but we haven't put those things in. We focused on the regulatory compliance fields. With that, we want to get into the features of the SLI.
Okay.
Now, what you're going to see is that it is a little bit different. We've showed this to some people, and the first reaction is, oh, it's busy. It is. It looks busy, and it's busy because it has more fields on it. It's busy because we've done an Excel sheet that has a lot of lines on it. So keep this in mind when you're looking at it. It's a model. It was easy for us to work with it. in the Excel format. But you know, it's to be able to give a design that you can hide lines, leave lines, you can do whatever you want to. But it does, you know, I would like you all to just step back a little bit and say, okay, let me digest this, and then react to it afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Matilda to go through the actual pieces of this document to show you how we've laid things out and what's different. So Matilda?
Great. Thanks, Paulette. Well, here are the two screenshots of the new SLI models that we will be reviewing today. Now, we created two versions of the SLI form. One is a portrait and one is a landscape. And they are slightly different from each other only because of the layout. So because we had to lay out one as a landscape model, some of the boxes are not numbered the same as you'll see in the portrait model. To tell you the truth, when we started designing the SLI, we're split as a group 50-50. Half of us liked the portrait, half of us liked the landscape. We really couldn't vote on which one was better than the other, so we kept them both. We understand that these look busier than some of the forms you're used to seeing, but that's because they include all the fields of information required for filing the electronic export information. And we're going to go over the key fields and differences in a few minutes here. All right, so some of the main features that we would like to point out of the new SLI models, both versions do include comment boxes. Now, these comment boxes have regulatory information in there, which would be very helpful, especially for first-time exporters. There's also a how to complete an SLI document that's available for each one of the SLI versions. The new SLI models are both complete with new regulatory fields that will be made effective on April 5th. And most importantly, the SLI models do allow for line-by-line item reporting of classification and of the license information. So let's take a look at the next slide. We can show you an example of what those comment boxes look like. Here you go. On an Excel spreadsheet, if you scroll over the red flag in the upper right-hand corner, or if you click on the field heading, you'll see the backup regulatory citation pop up in a comment window. This is the same information that is shown on how to complete the SLI document that accompanies this. So if you guys are saving this into like a PDF format, you know, depending on what you make your SLI out of, which form of document, there's that accompanying how to fill out an SLI sheet that will follow the number sequence with citations. If you use a fillable form, you probably will not see the flags, although fillable forms will give you other benefits. So let's take a look at that, how to complete the SLI document. Here's the screenshot of how to complete the SLI document. This is a very handy reference document, and unlike the comment boxes that you guys will be working with on the actual Excel spreadsheet, these how to complete SLI documents have hyperlinks to the actual regulations, and this on various government websites, and these hyperlinks are on the instruction sheet itself. Because the numbering is slightly different between the portrait and the landscape, we do have two separate spreadsheets based upon which document you are using. So we're going to go back to the SLI model itself and go over some of the highlights. So USPPI address versus the freight location address. The last time the foreign trade regulation was changed, there was a change in the USPPI address reporting. Although the USPPI name is reported, the address where the cargo begins its journey to the port of export must be reported. And because a shipper is also instructing the forwarder at the same time on how to show them on the transport document, like on an airway bill or bill of lading, we now allow the place to fill in both addresses on the new SLI models, just in case the addresses are different. So some of you may notice that the state of origin box, the box number 13, is still shown on the new SLI model. Both shippers and forwarders are used to this, and because the state of origin still remains a separate field in AES, we've decided to keep that field on this document as well. One of the new AES field requirements as of April 5th, as Paulette mentioned earlier, the revised Federal Trade Regulation that becomes effective on April 5th now requires the ultimate consignee type. So this is a mandatory reporting field for all transmissions to AES. In most cases, the forwarder will require the USPPI to provide this information to us. It is also important to use the other/unknown when the ultimate consignee really does not fit into the other categories. And again, the comment fields have the definitions of each ultimate consignee type. So when you design your own form, you may want to consider making this a drop-down box so you can have explanatory notes to your customers as to how to use the ultimate consignee type. Another new field here, well, in AES Direct, the new ultimate consignee requirement, it may require an internal system changes for those of you who are filing AES not directly in AES Direct. Those of you who are using AES Direct will be happy to know that AES Direct has been updated with the new field, and it'll look similar to this. We anticipate that they will open this up around March 22, so make sure you're ready for the change. You might want to talk to your internal software providers to make sure you guys are all set with the new ultimate consignee type.
Just 1 second, Matilda. Yeah, wasn't changing. We're good.
Okay, no problem. The exemptions have been removed. The exemptions from filing temporary exports and imports covered by the 15 CFR 30.37 are being removed effective April 5th. You now must report transactions over 2,500, and because of this new exemption, we altered the SLI model to have a box here where an exporter can check if there was a TIB or carnet involved in the shipment. And you can see there is a comment box now to check off the yes or no box and explaining the new regulation there. And of course, the main reason why we decided to address the SLI was for the line-by-line item reporting of licensing information. And you can see here with the print screen, we do have line-by-line reporting here. We know that many forwarders have adjusted their SLIs to allow for line-by-line item reporting and the ECCN number and license information. So if you only modify one thing on your SLI, it would be adding columns for the ECCN number and licensing information for each classification that the exporter is giving. Now, we talked a lot about licensing information so far, and I would like to talk a few minutes about the State Department of License fields. You know, it is in a forwarder's best interest to ask for a copy of the license. For example, you know, we need a copy of the license to gather some information and even verify information from the exporter for the transaction. But there's stuff here too that we cannot find on the license. For example, column number 26, the significant military equipment, the SME. You know, that's something you will not find on a license. So it's very helpful if the USPPI advises the forwarder, and therefore it's been included in the new SLI model on a line-by-line basis. The registration number, it's also helpful for the forwarder if the registration number is on the SLI. Even though it's also on the license, it helps to highlight the fact that this is a DDTC license transaction. You can also see 2 units measure columns and 2 value columns. We'll talk about that on the next couple of slides. Of course, the USPPI provides a license. They wouldn't have to complete the unit of measure or license value column, but we wanted to place these on the model in such a way that the forwarder realizes that these are additional fields with different requirements from the regular reporting requirements. So let's get back to the DDTC quantity and unit of measure that was mentioned before. The DDTC unit of measure is found on the license, And the shipper may provide a copy of the license and leave this blank on the SLI, and that's okay. But it's important for the AES filers to understand that the State Department unit of measure is almost always different from the Schedule B unit of measure. So therefore, we place columns next to each other to emphasize that point. So for example, you can have a Schedule B that's just asking for kilos, and you can come across a DD2C unit of measure that's asking for how many kits instead of the kilos of those kits. Okay. The license value is one of the new fields effective on April 5th, and the license value field is required for all license transactions, not just the State Department license. There's been some confusion about what value goes into this field, and it's the amount of the license being used for the cargo that is moving on that particular shipment. It might be the full value of the license, or it may be just part of the value, depending if it's on a partial shipment or not. So let's look at an example on this on the next slide. So here's a cutout of a Department of State license and a cutout of our new SLI model. In this example, you can see that the license covers 10 items. If you notice the items versus number for the Schedule B, with a total of $750,000 or $75,000 each. On this transaction, let's say only 2 items were being shipped. Therefore, we only report 2 items with a total of only $150,000, because on a separate shipment, they'll probably ship the remaining balance and up to the point where they may exhaust that license.
Matilda, if I could interject something here for a second.
Sure.
The reason that the license value field was added was because it's a different value than the value that's reported for statistical purposes. So I just need to mention that that value at the port of export for census purposes is supposed to include inland freight and insurance to the port of export. And what was happening is that if people were reporting it that way, they might use up the license value too quickly because it wasn't actually reflecting the amount of the license that was being used. So you can see in the example that we've arbitrarily marked up that value at the port of export by some money to show you that it's different, because one value for census includes inland freight insurance and the other value is just totally the amount that's from the license.
Correct. Thank you, Paulette. So just as the ultimate consignee type that we saw in a previous screen that was updated in AES Direct, the license value has now been updated as well. So you can see here that this will be in effect soon, and that would be a separate value to be entered once this comes into effect. Now this is very important. We would like to point out a few items here at the request of actually the BIS and Census. The commodity description, you see that it's highlighted here in gold. One is the commodity description, and this is not the Schedule B description. So when we're asking for the Schedule B number and a commodity description, we're not asking for the description that accompanies the Schedule B. This is a commercial description of the product that can be used. It describes the product that can be used to identify if the product has been assigned to the proper Schedule B. So that's something that lets CBP Customs Border Protection know that the product actually is what it is, and it fits that Schedule B description. We also highlighted in blue the vehicle reporting. This is because part of the new regulations is that it calls for EEI filing 72 hours prior to pre-departure for all vehicle values, even those that are $2,500 and under. This field always requires the vehicle information used for self-propelled vehicles, and we wanted to take the opportunity to point out that pre-departure and all value reporting requirements will be required effective April 5th. So now that we discussed the main changes and the highlights of the new SLI model, we want to remind everyone that the purpose of the SLI model is to give you something in which you can base your own document on. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Paulette to go over the details on how you can use the SLI model and customize it for your company.
Thank you, Matilda. Thanks for that great demonstration of what we've changed on there. Very, very nicely done. So now we just want to point out a couple of things that you need to be on the lookout for when you customize your document. The model that we have includes the minimum authorization language required by the regulation. So if you read it, it basically just says we authorize the forwarder to file the AES. Doesn't say anything else. You'll see that on most shippers' letters of instruction, it's a little bit more complex what's in the authorization line, allowing you to act for customs purposes and various other things. But we thought it prudent to just stick strictly with the foreign trade regulations for what we put here. Now, having said that, when you design your model, your SLI, you need to check with your legal counsel, your management, and say, what verbiage, what language do we want in this box? So again, this is the minimum required language for authorization. You're likely going to want to put some additional language in that box. So that, and even the document as a whole, it's important to check with your legal counsel, your management, to say, does this meet our internal policies? Because every company interprets things just a little bit differently and has different requirements. So I'm really recommending that everybody takes that step. Another thing that we put on here is a means of having an electronic signature. You may work for a company that doesn't allow electronic signatures, so you need to check that. If that's the case, you just want to remove that when you create your own document. Now, also, I just wanted to point out here where we're talking about authorization, we already had a question at the beginning about whether an SLI should be filled out when it's a routed export transaction. Again, we could talk about routed export transactions for a long time, but this is how we've handled it on the SLI. You know, as we mentioned at the very beginning, it's a multi-purpose document giving data elements that are still required to be provided on a routed export transaction, giving transportation instructions, maybe consent to screen. There's a lot of reasons. So there's a box, the standard box that's on every SLI, whether it's a routed export transaction. If you have a routed export transaction, you would say yes. And when you got down to this point, it says check here if you're authorizing the forwarder. If it's a routed export transaction and you're not authorizing the forwarder because the foreign principal is authorizing the forwarder, you just don't check the box. So we would expect to see routed export transaction, and in most cases have this box be unchecked. So that's how we're dealing with it on this document. And again, forwarders may have different ways of how they address authorization on their SLIs, but as a model, this is how we decided to do it so that the USPPI has a choice there. Of course, on a standard export transaction, you have to authorize the forwarder. So if you've given a power of attorney document, maybe you don't need to check the box every single transaction and you're using an SLI to provide information. But one way or the other, that freight forwarder shouldn't be filing anything into the automated export system without authorization. Then again, in general, you want to customize and create your own form. So Matilda was kind enough to allow us to use her logo here. But for instance, in the forwarding agent box, you just want to put your own forwarder information. You want to choose the type of document that you're using. You know, you might want to use a fillable form. Excel, we've put this out there in Excel, but there are some limitations to Excel. You don't want a PDF, an online version. Again, you know, depending on the type of company that you're working for, you may have various requirements on how your documents should look. Of course, you want to brand it, your logo, your address, your colors, whatever the marketing people want to do in your own company is something that you want to do when you create your own. You might want to add your regulatory licensing information. If you're doing ocean freight, your FMC number is supposed to be on all your documents, so that might be something you put in there with your logo. Again, as I mentioned earlier, reflect your internal compliance policies. So you have to look at the language that's in some of those boxes and say, is this what I want? Now, add terms and conditions. Some forwarders put their terms and conditions on the back of their shipper's letter of instruction so that their customers have know in advance what the terms and conditions are that that company works under. So if that's what your company does, then you'll want to add those. So again, it's something you have to decide within each of your organizations. Add your company-specific documentation and transportation instruction requirements. Now, we know this is going to be the biggest thing about this model is it doesn't have those fields. And again, they were so different from company to company. That's something that you need to add yourself. So working from the SLI model, we've given you this in Excel. It's an open document. So it's password protected so that people don't type over the field names, but if you can unprotect that, and you can adjust the field names if you want to. You can add fields to the section because it's an Excel document. It's easy to, at least for design purposes, to add your own fields, so you can add some rows. You can renumber the fields if you do add some of your own. And you can take the How to Complete the SLI document, which again is also an open document. It's numbered according to the forms we've put out there. But if you add 5 or 6 fields to gather additional transportation information and you renumber it, then you can just add some cells into that instruction document and renumber those to match your new document. So you have a good basis already that explains all of the regulatory stuff. And then you can add in the appropriate places what you need to for your own company-specific document. As I said, we've added a place at the suggestion of a forwarder that looked at this recently, and so we added a place for instructions to the forwarder. So right now, it's just an open box where somebody could type in instructions to the forwarder. But what's going to be preferable for each forwarder or exporter who's doing, using a document like this to be able to give their information to the forwarder is to customize that. So here's one example. You take that box, it can be filled out, or you take that box and instead of that, you add rows where you can put the Incoterms. Is it prepaid or collect? What's the mode of transportation? So this is an example of what one company would do in place of that instructions to the forwarder document. So when they create their own document, they would replace it with the information they want to collect for their company. You might see the consent to screen statement in a place like that. So to summarize here, we have the SLIs and the accompanying instruction sheets are available to all forwarders and exporters at the link we have here. This is not just for NCBFAA members. We really wanted to be able to provide a tool that people could use, maybe drive some consistency, but at least to get everybody on the same page with what fields are required. So this is open for anybody to download and use to design their own document. So you have 2 versions of the spreadsheets and you have 2 versions of the instruction document. If you're not going to do a completely new document or a complete remodel, I'd say that at the very least it's important that you make sure that your SLI includes all of the fields we have on the model. From a regulatory standpoint, all that information is required to be collected to do a proper AES transmission. If you do follow the format, it takes a long time for maybe a new standard to be in place, but it will drive consistency in the industry if people are kind of following what we have out there. So again, it's we're not in a place to tell everybody how to do their business. We just wanted to provide a tool to give you an idea on how you might be able to lay out your document to be able to accommodate new requirements and also the line item reporting. And will the format ever change? Well, things are changing pretty quickly out there, and I think we're going to see some major changes over the next few years on how data is collected. We know that some companies are transmitting data electronically. The government's looking at different kinds of pre-departure requirements. I mean, any number of things could change, and I just think I'm stealing that word agile from customs that they're using in ACE development to throw in here. I just think we need to kind of stay alert, and there may be some requirements in the future that involve us having to redesign again. So I think that's the problem with the old document, is nobody ever really addressed it. And now we have a wide variation of things where people picked up one piece of information or another. So hopefully this will standardize it a bit. Now we are giving you just some links. We have, again, a link to the documents, a link to our USPPI sheet. We've had this out there for a while, and how forwarders use this is to provide this to the less knowledgeable exporters to say, okay, here's where you can go to get some easy explanation. So some of it is regulatory links, but a lot of it is just, for instance, the BIS, what is an ECCN, just to give some place to go for the exporter to give them some background information. And we've just modified that document as well to include the extra fields for the foreign trade regulations, and that's posted on the website as well. And then we've given you links to some of the government agency pages if there's anybody on the call today that's not familiar enough with those. So on that note, before I go into the questions, we have a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to show you something about the document, and then we will move into the questions. So just give me a minute here. And I want to be able to pull up, well, first of all, let me pull up the USPPI sheet, if this will come up. This document I'm referring to USPPI responsibility information sheet that we have. Looks like I might have to come out of that. I just wanted to show you that really quickly. That's what it looks like, and you can link to that on the system. So let me come out of that, because I really wanted to see if I could bring up the SLI model itself, just to show you a couple of things. This is what it looks like. It's a spreadsheet. And just to give you some ideas, I've taken something like this forwarding agent box. You can format this to remove the lines. That's what I've done there, just to hide the lines. And that way it looks a little cleaner. That's something you can do. Another issue with an Excel sheet is when you merge, we've merged cells. And when you do that, the cell won't grow with the amount of information you put in. So you can always just take that and make it bigger if you need to. So I just wanted to show you a couple of things like that. But this is the bigger version of what this document looks like that we've been explaining to you. And you'll be able to see that at those links. So having said that now, we just want to go into the Q&A. And again, if you have, we'll attempt to answer regulatory questions and to the best that we can. We may have to refer you back to a government agency, and but we'll give that a shot. But we would like to try to focus on the form and the use of the form. So with that, I'll turn that back over to Cece, so you can let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Paulette. Before we go into the questions, I'm getting a lot of questions about a copy of the presentation. A link to download a copy of the presentation was included in the webinar credential email. You just need to scroll down to the heading that says presentation and then click the link. And then at the end of the presentation, like Paulette showed you, you can download a copy of the form on that the first link on the resources page. And to unprotect the form, the password is SLI. So Paulette, the first question is the one that we had discussed before the webinar. Did you need me to read that again?
You can if you want to. As a courtesy to the person that sent it in, it's always worth re-emphasizing that particular point. A lot of people will have that question, I think.
Okay. Should an exporter complete the SLI if the export is a routed transaction? Or should the exporter make sure the information is on the commercial invoice and other shipping documents? In other words, is the new SLI similar to a power of attorney authorizing a freight forwarder to transmit EEI data on behalf of their client?
So just to reemphasize, what I said, when you don't have to check that box, and we specifically named the forwarder box just forwarder, not authorized agent or anything like that, just forwarder. Because some people feel a little bit wary of that, like I'm giving authorization anyway. So you don't check the box, you're not conferring authorization. As for providing information on commercial documents, we acknowledged at the beginning a lot of exporters do that. It's a real challenge for forwarders, I'll tell you. Some of it's very complicated, some of it's very hard to find. But, as long as all of the information is there, it's there. What we're hoping from the forwarding side is that you do put the information in a uniform way on a document like this, because it really helps the forwarding agent to do a more accurate and more efficient transmission. But anyway, it's about checking that box, checking off routed, and not checking the authorization box.
Okay, thank you. This next question, regarding RETs, it might be good to have various fields grayed out / unable to complete under RETs where the USPPI does not wish to provide information beyond the required data elements. What do you think?
Well, I think, it'd be interesting to know which fields you're talking about. I mean, if we're still talking about the authorization box, that would be something. But again, this is a model. So I guess that's something for all the forwarders that are on the call today to take into consideration when they're designing their form. And forwarders come in various shapes and sizes. Some have very sophisticated IT departments that can create a document that would allow for that type of thing. So if you check off routed, maybe it blocks out the authorization box. And others don't. They just don't have those resources, and they work from very simple documents. So I think that's something that people can take back. I think it's also important to know that even on a routed export transaction, there are some cases where the USPPI gets the authorization to do that. So there are some cases where the USPPI is the one who's authorizing the forwarder because they were authorized by the FPPI to do it. But certainly it's something that I think any forwarder on the call can take into consideration when they're designing their form.
Okay, thank you. How do we report an OFAC T10 license value on the SLI, as OFAC licenses do not have a numeric value? Do we enter 0?
Well, that's a good question, and I would say that we probably have to check with the government on that. When it comes to these things, it's always theoretical until you actually have to do one. If there is no value, then there's no value to report. So I don't want to, while we're on the phone, on the teleconference now, check the AES trade interface requirements to see what it says. But we can check that. And Cece, do we know who that question came in from?
Yeah, I can give that information to you later.
Well, we can send it to the entire group, whatever we do. So I think we can look that up, though, to see what it says, because if that's the case, then they should not require it for that type of license, and that's how the AES system should work. So we'll have to check on it.
Okay. Do freight forwarders prefer corporations to use their own SLI formats, or do they use should they use the SLI provided by the forwarder?
Wow. Okay. Freight forwarders always wish that their customers would use that freight forwarder's own SLI. That's what a freight forwarder hopes for. The reality, of course, is quite a bit different, because you can ask, but if somebody already has something that they use that their own system generates, that's what you're going to get. And if it's a commercial document, if it's an SLI, I mean, it can take various forms, but a freight forwarder will always wish that their customer gives it to them on their own SLI form.
Okay. Could there be another box stating that this is a routed transactions and you are not giving authorization to file?
Well, I think we could so there's an either or. I mean, that's a good suggestion. We can take that under advisement. And And again, for any freight forwarder who's on the phone that's designing their form and they want to add something like that to their own form, that's certainly something to take into consideration. And again, this is a model. Anything can be added or subtracted. We don't want subtracting really because we tried to tie this to it. But I know that you're wanting it to be more clear so there's not a mistake there where you have an either or, you check that you're giving it or you're not giving it. And I can understand that, and some forwarders do it that way. So we'll take it under advisement for the model, and any forwarder on the phone should take that under advisement for creating their own document. Thank you for that suggestion.
Okay. The next question, I work in a global company that ships various types of goods between subsidiaries on a daily basis. In some cases, the ultimate consignee will be the end user, and in other cases, they will be on site to sell the goods to their customers. Can we determine one ultimate consignee type based on what is most frequently applicable, or does it need to be determined by the shipment?
You know, that's such an interesting question. The regulation reads that it's whichever applies the most often. Now, that's a question that I would like to escalate to the Bureau of Industry and Security, because this isn't driven by census needing to decide which, to keep statistics on it. This is BIS wanting to know. So I will escalate that question to them because the regulation reads clearly. It says whatever applies the most often. But if you're really thinking about why they would want it, you think they'd want it on a per shipment basis. So my guess is, aside from the fact that they're probably going to see a lot of other unknown at the beginning, and they'll probably start addressing that, I think that the regulation reads clearly, but we should escalate the question to BIS to see if that's really what they meant. And maybe they'll put out some kind of a clarification or FAQ on that. But if you put the one that applies the most often, that's how the regulation reads.
Okay. We are an exporter that files our own AES. However, our carriers request SLI for the purpose of BOL preparation. Would our SLI need a signature since we are not authorizing a forwarder to file an AES?
I would say that there's two, if you look at the old SED form, there were two places to sign, one for authorization and one for certifying to truth and correctness. This form signature is to certify the truth and correctness, and I would say that a signature on a form like that is a good thing to have, that someone's taken the responsibility that the information is correct. And I guess it's not giving authorization if the authorization box is not checked. So if you're filing your own and you're just providing the information, you still want to sign to the truth and accuracy of the information. I would say one thing, to any exporter who files their own AES, it's not actually the norm. So a forwarding agent is filing AES transaction after transaction after transaction, and the one that comes in saying, here's my ITN, I filed it myself, is the exception. And sometimes that's missed, and a duplicate is filed that has to subsequently be canceled. So I would say that if you are using the form, make it very, very clear, highlight it, put a box around it, do something to make it very clear that you filed your own AES on that, and you're just providing information for transportation purposes, and here's my ITN. So, I'm just saying that if it's hidden in a lot of other information, it might be missed by the forwarder.
Okay, thank you. If the shipment is LVS that does not require filing less than $2,500 per commodity, is it required or confusing to include anyway?
I think it's a good idea to transmit that, and I think a lot of companies will do that. It's not, I think it just needs to be clear that the forwarder should, if you've put it on there, it's because you want it filed. And I would have to check because I thought the LVS needed to be filed anyway, but I may be wrong about that. But I think it's a good idea, and that's just my opinion. It's not any kind of a legal advice, but I think that if you want it filed, you should ask the forwarder to file everything just how you put it on your SLI, including under 2,500. People do file under 2,500 for various reasons.
Okay, thank you. If I am a documentation company that prepares documents for the shipper, but the shipper sends the SLI, how best to ensure forwarder follows my documentation instructions?
So the SLI is coming from the exporter,
shipper.
and the documentation's coming from a documentation preparation company. Mm-hmm. Well, and if there's conflicting information, then I guess that the forwarder is going to have to check back with the exporter to see what's correct, and otherwise there shouldn't be conflicting information. So, I mean, that's a tough one, because if an exporter has hired somebody to do the documentation, there should be good coordination between those two parties. And the only thing I can say is if there's any difference between the commercial documents, anyway, if there's ever a difference between commercial documents and an SLI, there's a reason to be getting back in touch with that exporter to find out what's correct. I hope that answers it. I mean, you can't take one over the other. It shouldn't be the forwarder's responsibility to decide which document is correct.
Okay. Will mode of transport no longer be required in AES?
It definitely is required in AES. If you're asking the question because we don't have it on the form, it's because the forwarder is the one who's usually knowing the mode of transportation, and the mode of transportation doesn't always match what you would select. So if a forwarder designs the form and they fill in a place that says air, ocean, truck, rail, and you're going to check off which one you want, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the mode of transportation that's going to be filed in AES, and the forwarder usually knows that information. So, because that's what the forwarder has been hired for, is to handle the transportation. So if you check off ocean freight and that vessel is going to sail out of Montreal, the mode of transportation for AES is going to be truck or rail crossing the Canadian border. So these fields were left off because they are, from an AES standpoint, known by the forwarder already because they're making the transportation arrangements. And they won't necessarily match the mode of transportation that you as an exporter are going to ask a forwarder to, to tell them how to move your cargo. So I hope that answers it. It's the reason we didn't put it on. And they're two separate things. Telling a forwarder how you want them to move the cargo and the mode of transportation and the port of export that get reported for AES are many times two completely separate, distinct, different pieces of information. But it is definitely still required.
Okay. Is the form adjusted to handle export control reform?
Could you repeat that, Cece?
Is the form adjusted to handle export control reform?
Well, I'm not sure, and maybe that person who submitted that can submit some clarification. Export control reform, from that standpoint, has special instructions of a 600 series ECCN must also be put on the transport documents. Well, by now, forwarders should know that. When they see a 600 series ECCN on the document, the forwarder should know to put it on the transport documents. Now, in the example I had in the presentation, I actually put it in the special instructions to the forwarder because it's also an exception to the rule. And so there's been a lot of training going on within forwarding organizations to make sure they recognize them. But in fact, looking at hundreds and hundreds of shipments and then one comes through with a 600 series ECCN, you have to be really alert to see it. So if you have some special instruction because of export control reform, I would always say that you should highlight that somewhere on the document anyway because it's new. Not because forwarders don't know what to do with it, but just because it's new and it's exception to what most transactions are. But as for adjusting the form, I'm not sure what it is we would need to adjust. So if whoever submitted that question can maybe submit some clarification, then we can certainly take that into consideration. Matilda, do you have any other idea about that?
I was training on how to declare the ECCN number versus any exceptions. And while we do allow those additional columns that we added on this SLI, I do think still more clarification is required on that question.
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, like I said, there's been an awful lot of training within forwarding organizations about recognizing those ECCNs, about making sure they're reported no matter what the value is, except for the subcategory Y, which is also, you know, there had to be one exception to make it a little more difficult to train. And the fact that it has to be on the transport document. So I still would recommend to anybody that they put an extra note on there, reminding people that reminding the forwarder that this is 600 series and it has special requirements. But again, if you have any specific request on what would need to be added or changed on the form, then please let us know.
Okay. How do you file an AES for a shipment exported under a foreign carnet where there is no U.S. PPI?
Well, there is a question that a lot of forwarders and brokers don't want to have to be addressing, but are addressing. When there's, it would, you know, if there's a foreign carnet, the regulations say if there is no U.S. party, then the broker has to take on the role of the U.S. PPI. Now, I can tell you, within the forwarding and broker community, there's an awful lot of discussion about that right now, because it depends what that entails. You know, is all of a sudden, does that entail classification, license determination, and that type of thing? You probably have foreign-made product that comes in, and it's just going to turn around and go back out. So I can only tell you that if you called up the government now, they would say the regulation says that when there's no U.S. party, the broker has to take on that role. I will also tell you that our export compliance subcommittee has this on our agenda, and we're putting together several scenarios to be able to go to census and maybe BIS, but at least census, and say, okay, what about this, what about this, what about this? But I just had the opportunity to have a brief discussion just 2 nights ago with Joe Cortez from Census, and it's very clear in their minds that the regulation is clear, saying the broker. So it's a difficult topic right now, but it is a topic that's on our agenda to pursue and see exactly what the expectation is.
Okay. Can box 32 reference all AES exemptions, section 30.37, or exclusions, 30.2D, instead of just low value?
Okay. Is that the box that just says if there's anything left under 2,500? Because I'm not looking at the form right at this minute.
Yes, Paulette, that is correct.
So you just, you know, first of all, this is no longer a required field. It's kind of a best practice to let people, let the forwarder know, and sometimes like customs know, that there's shipments under 2,500. So I think we need to take that under advisement. And CC, I'd like to, if we could get that one, if you could send that one to us, so that we could take a look at that and come back with an answer, or at least put it on our discussion list of changes.
Okay. The next question, I may have misunderstood. Would you please verify the Schedule B value? Would it be different from the license value due to the Schedule B value including the inland freight and insurance? If Schedule B value does include inland and insurance, is this a new regulation?
Well, this is a conversation that we hate having. The value for census is supposed to include inland freight and insurance to the port of export that's reported, and it's not new. It's been there always. The reporting practices, however, have not always complied with that. The reason it's there is because globally the statistics, the exporting statistics of a country is measured the same way for every country. So everybody reports their statistics, the value at the port of export. So when you see the balance of trade. It should be based on the fact of here's the value at the port of export for shipments out of the U.S., here's the value at the port of export for shipments out of Italy, out of Brazil, so it's all measured the same way. So it's not new. It's also extremely difficult to come up with that number. And I know in the last census town hall, and I know we have a few people from census attending this call today, in the last census town hall, the recommendation was call your forwarder for that information, but it's also very, very difficult for a forwarder to pinpoint that amount, because a lot of times it's embedded in a freight rate that you get from an air carrier or an ocean carrier. And the recommendation that we've always gotten from census is do your best to estimate it. So I can only say that. I can only say that the regulation has not changed, it's not new, and it's the reason that they put in the license value, because in theory it should be different than the value at the port of export. But not new, very difficult to come up with the right amount to put in there though.
Okay. Regarding non-routed or routed transactions, is it mandatory that the SLI is signed by the US PPI in original or electronic format?
You know, going back to the other question we had about truth and accuracy, the signature is not what is giving the authorization. It's checking the authorization box that's giving the authorization. The signature is to let somebody know that someone has taken responsibility for the information that's being presented. So it is to confirm the truth and accuracy of the information that has been provided. If someone checks off the authorization box, that signature is also certifying over that authorization. So a forwarder does want a signature on the SLI because, you know, and again, and that suggestion about authorization, you know, yes or no, that's certainly something that can be taken into consideration. You can always type right on there, this is not authorization. If you're not comfortable just not checking the box, just put a note right on it. It's not authorization, it's a routed export transaction. But the signature is important to a forwarder.
Okay. For the value at the port of export field, is the inland freight and insurance something the shipper should be responsible for determining and adding to the value of the goods, or is this something the forwarder will have to determine?
It's different for every transaction. That's why it's such a challenge. Sometimes an exporter has it embedded in their selling the amount that they're selling it for. Sometimes the freight forwarder does not know the Incoterms, so you can't tell whether or not it's there. You know, again, one week your freight might be flying out of Chicago, and the next week it's flying from Chicago to Miami and then flying out of Miami. You've got two different ports of export, two different amounts of money. It's almost impossible to come up with the accurate amount, and again, census just says to estimate it. So I think you have to work it out with your freight forwarder because, like I said, the freight forwarder doesn't necessarily know either. If they give you an ocean freight rate from Chicago to Hong Kong, there's not even a way for the forwarder to know how much of that is inland freight from Chicago to LA or wherever. So that is, you know, so it depends, because sometimes the exporter does know, and sometimes the freight forwarder might have a better way of finding out or being in a better position to estimate it. I can't really answer the question because every shipment is different.
Okay. Is DDTC registration number a required data element for AES when there is a DDTC license, or is it just a best practice to give the forwarder?
It's a required data reporting field in AES. So the exporter, it's the exporter's registration number. It should be on the license anyway, and again, we recommend that a forwarder always gets a copy of a State Department license so they can really see full descriptions of product and the parties and all of that. So the registration number will always be on there. It is a required field. Putting it also on the SLI, or if you're an exporter who just does not give your State Department licenses to the forwarder, then you have to put it there. It's a required reporting field. And also, if it's not a valid registration number, you actually get a fatal error from AES saying it's not valid. and the transmission won't go through.
Okay, thank you. This next question will be the last question that we'll read on the webinar today. If your question wasn't answered, we'll be sending it to the presenters for follow-up via email. So this is the last question. In a routed export transaction, would you recommend modifying the document to provide line item detail instead of Schedule B commodity-driven information, as the shipment may be consolidated with other shipments from the same U.S. PPI? For example, shipments going to the MX border where the FPPI's forwarding agent is building shipments. The shipment as it is left the U.S. PPI's facility may or may not be what's being exported.
Okay, so Cece, I'm going to ask you to read it one more time because I just want to digest the end of that, if you don't mind.
Oh, I actually just X'd out of that question. I don't have access to that question anymore.
Oh, okay. So that's all right. So basically, if I'm understanding it correctly, the information might be consolidated at the border. So maybe there are several shipments from the same U.S. PPI going into Mexico or any other country, and it's going to be gathered at the border. So maybe the amounts that are actually going represent more than that one shipment or only a piece of that shipment or something like that. So I think presenting the information on the SLI, it's important to present that, and it's important for the forwarder to know how to consolidate that information if they are consolidating cargo. So for instance, if you take an under 2,500 as an example, if you have a shipment that's under 2,500 and now it's going to be consolidated with two other shipments from the same U.S. PPI to the same FPPI in the same, so it's going to be consolidated and go across the border in the same shipment, the forwarder needs to know that it has to be reported if when you add them all together, they're over $2,500. It's a little more difficult, I'd say, if pieces were going to be pulled out of it, but you have to be able to provide backup documentation that makes it clear to the forwarder exactly what the values are of the cargo that will be moving in any particular transaction. So I don't know if it's a matter of the form being adjusted or if you're meaning what information is on the form, but and so maybe you can offer some additional clarity, but I would just say that, you know, if you're moving something and you don't know what's going to move at any given time, you're just sending it all and they're going to gather it over a period of days and then ship it at one time, the forwarder needs to know to add all of that together and make sure that they're reporting everything, even if they were under 2,500 on the individual SLIs. So on that note, I would say that it would be important to even show on a line item basis the items that are under 2,500, so that the forwarder, so that they're all listed and that the forwarder can take those Schedule Bs and say, okay, here's the Schedule B, it's on 5 different SLIs, and when I add them all together, it comes out to more than 2,500, so I have to report it. It's more difficult if you leave them off the SLI and they have to go digging through paperwork, hopefully, to find it there. So if you could offer some clarity on what you mean about changing the form, but otherwise, hopefully that answered the question for you.
Okay, thank you so much. So with that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining, and thank you so much to Paulette and Matilda for all your time and efforts on the forms and today's presentation. I'd like to remind everyone that points will be applied to your transcript within 2 weeks, and to please take the time to complete the survey that was included in the webinar credential email. Thank you again for your participation, and enjoy the rest of your